The unspoken code. The summer sun bore down on Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Derek Evans, a black royal guard, stood stoically at his post. He was only 32, but already a seasoned guard, having withstood 5 grueling years of rigorous discipline and training to earn his place. Today was just another day in his silent duty, or so he thought. The changing of the guard ceremony was a spectacle that attracted a sea of tourists. Families, couples, and travelers from all over the world gathered, drawn by the precision, the grandeur, and the sense of tradition that the royal guards embodied. To most tourists, Derek and his fellow guards were more than soldiers. They were symbols of British pride and heritage. But for Derek, his position carried a weighty duality. He wasn't just upholding the image of Buckingham Palace. He was a black man carrying centuries of tradition on his shoulders. The sun was intense that day, and the air was thick with the kind of heat that made one's skin sticky under layers of clothing. Beneath his iconic red tunic and heavy bearskin cap, Derek could feel the trickles of sweat that he had trained himself to ignore. The crowd buzzed with excitement and murmurs, phones and cameras flashing as tourists tried to capture the timelessness of the scene. The guards' synchronized steps echoed off the palace's towering walls, their movements meticulous, and their postures unbreakable. It was during these ceremonies that Derek found himself reminiscing. He thought of the hours he spent earning his spot, defying his own doubts and the low expectations others had placed on him. For him, wearing the uniform wasn't just about being a guard. It was about being part of a legacy that had often excluded people like him, about proving he was as much a part of Britain as anyone else. The quiet murmurings of the crowd started to blend into white noise for Derek, as it always did. But then, amid the murmurs, a voice cut through the crowd, louder, sneering. "Hey, you, can't you crack a smile, soldier?" The voice belonged to a woman, blonde, with an accent that hinted she might not be from around here. Derek ignored it. Training had taught him to disregard such taunts, as the guards were often the targets of playful jests. But this was different. The woman's voice was laced with a bitterness that was hard to dismiss. She pushed through the crowd, coming closer to the line, her laughter carrying a harsh edge. Tourists around her shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. "What's the point of having a statue like you stand here all day?" she mocked, holding her phone up, as if he were an attraction she had paid for. "Can you even speak English, or are you just here because they felt like they needed a bit of diversity?" Her words stung like a slap. Derek's expression remained unmoved, but a flicker of pain passed through his eyes. He had heard such comments before, often unspoken but heavily implied. His stance remained rigid, his gaze unwavering, as he focused on the grand architecture ahead of him, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The woman took Derek's silence as a challenge. She stepped closer, her voice rising with every word. "Are you dumb, or just deaf?" she sneered, a mocking laugh escaping her lips. "You can stand here all day, but that doesn't make you one of them. You're just filling a quota." Around her, the crowd's mood grew tense. Some onlookers glanced at each other with unease, shifting uncomfortably. A few tried to look away, but others were entranced by the spectacle, waiting to see how far the woman would go. Derek's pulse quickened, but his face remained a mask of indifference. He repeated the guard's mantra silently to himself. "Stay poised. Remain unmoved." Then, as if emboldened by his silence, the woman's taunts became harsher. "Maybe if we had real Brits here, they'd have more backbone. You look as stiff as a puppet, all dressed up, but no courage to defend yourself. Ha!" She laughed, and her voice was shrill and cutting. Derek's jaw tightened. He reminded himself that he was here to represent something greater than himself, to uphold a tradition that had lasted through generations. But the sting of her words gnawed at him, digging into insecurities he had long buried. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, but he focused on his training, letting the woman's words flow over him like water against stone. To his side, a young boy tugged on her sleeve. "Aunt Lucy," he whispered, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Why is he just standing there? Doesn't he care?" The woman, whom Derek now identified as Aunt Lucy, looked down at the boy with a smirk. "Because he's trained to, Daniel," she replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's his job to stand there and look tough. But really, he's nothing. Just a costume and a silly hat." Derek's hands clenched around his rifle, his knuckles turning white under his gloves. He inhaled slowly, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing. This was just another day. Just another tourist crossing lines they couldn't understand. However, Lucy wasn't done. "Here, Daniel," she said, reaching into her purse. "Have some fun." She handed the boy a peanut, her lips curling into a sly smile. The boy hesitated, glancing between the peanut and his aunt. "Go on," she urged, nudging him. "Toss it at him. Let's see if he's really made of stone." The boy, looking up at her uncertainly, finally tossed the peanut. It hit Derek's polished boot and bounced harmlessly onto the ground. Derek remained impassive, but his mind was a storm of emotions. The insult was childish, yet deeply humiliating. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the uniform he wore, the values he represented. Another guard, a few steps down the line, caught Derek's eye and gave him the faintest nod of solidarity. He knew the drill: ignore, endure, let it pass. But the woman's provocations had stirred something deeper within him, something he couldn't easily shake off. Lucy, seeing Derek's unwavering stance, scowled and muttered under her breath. She turned to the boy, frustration evident on her face. "Let's go. Clearly, he's as brainless as he looks." As she led the boy away, Derek allowed himself a moment of introspection. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice in his role. But today, under the oppressive summer sun and the weight of his own silence, something felt different. This wasn't just about enduring an insult. It was about questioning how much more he was willing to take. How far was he willing to go to protect a tradition that demanded his silence in the face of such blatant disrespect? Derek returned his gaze forward, his posture never wavering. But a seed of doubt had been planted. For the first time in his career, he found himself wondering if standing silent was enough. The job required resilience, yes, but was it worth his dignity? And as he felt the weight of his rifle against his shoulder, he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps today would be a turning point, not just for him, but for what it meant to be a royal guard in a world that hadn't fully accepted him. The line crossed. As Derek resumed his post the next day, he hoped the incident with Lucy would fade, absorbed by the endless cycle of tourists and ceremonies. Yet the woman's sneering taunts lingered in his mind, simmering under the calm mask he wore. He trained himself to stand unmoved, yet something about her words had stirred a part of him that he'd worked hard to silence, a part that questioned if he was more than a ceremonial figurehead, if he had a voice. The morning passed uneventfully until, as if conjured by the thoughts in his head, Derek noticed a familiar flash of blonde in the crowd gathering near the east gate. He narrowed his gaze, barely moving, hoping his eyes had deceived him. But it was her, Lucy, standing among the throngs of tourists with a smug look on her face. The sight of her made his pulse quicken, his shoulders tense. He couldn't fathom why she'd return, or what satisfaction she found in targeting him specifically. Lucy's voice cut through the crowd, loud and brash, as she snapped pictures of the guards with exaggerated motions. A small group of tourists gravitated toward her, drawn by her over-the-top antics, unaware of her previous day's taunts. She posed as though she were a comedian on stage, coaxing her small audience into laughter. Derek's fingers twitched with irritation beneath his gloves, but he remained still, rooted in his commitment to duty. Is he going to just stand there all day again? Lucy exclaimed, pointing at Derek, her voice drenched with sarcasm. I thought these guards were supposed to be tough. But look at him, just a mannequin in a funny costume. The people around her chuckled awkwardly, some of them glancing at Derek with uncertain expressions. Her tone carried an edge that made her commentary more than just playful banter. It was confrontational, intentionally degrading. Beside her was young Daniel, clutching his toy guard figure, looking up at his aunt with wide, apprehensive eyes. Derek noticed the boy's hesitation, the way he shuffled his feet, unsure if his aunt's behavior was funny or wrong. He was caught between his admiration for his aunt and a growing discomfort with her words. Derek couldn't help but feel sorry for the kid, caught up in someone else's hostility without fully understanding it. Lucy, emboldened by the attention of the crowd, turned back to Derek. "What's the matter, soldier? Can't break that prestigious stance, can you?" She sneered, her words oozing sarcasm. "Or are you too afraid of what your bosses would say if you actually acted like a real person?" Derek's jaw clenched. His fellow guards, a few paces down the line, stood silent and unmoved, likely hearing her but choosing to ignore the taunts. But he felt their quiet solidarity, the shared understanding of what it took to stand in their position. Most tourists respected the guards. Even children sensed the weight of their duty and kept their distance. But Lucy's insults had grown bolder, her tone sharper, as if she were determined to provoke him. The crowd murmured, the atmosphere shifting uncomfortably. Derek could see some onlookers exchanging uneasy glances, and a couple of parents pulled their children away, sensing that Lucy's mockery had crossed a line. Yet others watched with rapt attention, their phones held aloft, recording the spectacle, unaware of the tension brimming beneath the surface. Lucy, seeing her crowd thinning, raised her voice even louder, her tone turning venomous. "This is what they call Britain's best," she scoffed, sweeping her arm dramatically to indicate Derek. "If you're going to wear that uniform, you should at least be proud of it, not just stand there like a coward." Her words stung. Derek had faced racially charged comments before, and he'd spent years building up the mental fortitude to withstand them. But Lucy's relentless taunts poked at something deeper, something that felt personal. She wasn't just mocking him as a guard. She was questioning his right to be there at all. Then, in a move that left Derek and the onlookers stunned, Lucy extended her hand and slapped him across the face. The slap wasn't hard, more a taunting gesture, but the sting of it was enough to send a jolt of shock through Derek's body. The crowd gasped, a ripple of surprise and discomfort spreading through the spectators. The unspoken rule had been broken. A guard was untouchable, part of the sanctity of the royal tradition. To slap a guard was an insult not only to the individual but to the honor of the role itself. Derek's heart thundered in his chest as he struggled to maintain his composure, but he felt something crack within him. The years of restraint, of swallowing down hurt and turning the other cheek, buckled under the weight of this final indignity. In one swift motion, Derek took a step back, his body tense and poised as he looked her squarely in the eyes. He could feel every gaze in the crowd upon him, the tension in the air thick and palpable. Lucy's face, initially smug, faltered slightly as she sensed the shift in his demeanor. But before he could say a word, he was interrupted by a familiar voice from behind him. Sergeant Evans, at ease. The voice was low and authoritative, and Derek immediately recognized it as belonging to Captain Harrison, his superior. Derek straightened, forcing himself to stand down as Captain Harrison approached, his face impassive but his eyes sharp, assessing the scene. He turned to Lucy, his voice calm but laced with a warning edge. "Madam, this is not the place for your theatrics. The guards are here to serve their duty with respect and dignity, and I expect visitors to do the same," Captain Harrison said, his tone icily polite. Lucy crossed her arms defiantly, a sneer playing at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, come on, Captain," she drawled, her voice dripping with disdain. "It was just a slap. You'd think these guards would have thicker skin. Isn't that part of the job?" Captain Harrison's gaze turned steely, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "Our guards are here to represent the tradition of the crown," he replied, his voice controlled but unmistakably firm. "Your behavior is both disrespectful and unwarranted. I will ask you to leave the premises immediately." Lucy's smug expression faltered, but she quickly masked it with an indignant glare. She huffed, grabbing Daniel's hand and pulling him along with her as she stalked off, her shoulders stiff with irritation. The boy glanced back at Derek, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and regret. Derek offered him a barely perceptible nod, acknowledging the boy's unspoken apology. The crowd slowly dispersed, whispers of shock and disapproval rippling through them. But for Derek, the encounter lingered in his mind, the sting of the slap a reminder of everything he'd had to endure in silence. As he resumed his post, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. After the ceremony ended, Derek found himself called to Captain Harrison's office. The captain's tone was measured, but there was an underlying tension that made Derek's stomach clench. "Sergeant Evans," Captain Harrison began, "you showed restraint today. That woman's behavior was unacceptable, and I want you to know that I support you. However, I am concerned about how close this came to escalating." Derek nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "Sir, I understand. But there are times when it feels like standing here in silence isn't enough. I was raised to respect the uniform, but it feels as though wearing it sometimes comes at a price." Captain Harrison's gaze softened slightly, a hint of understanding crossing his face. "I won't pretend to understand everything you're dealing with, Evans. But know this, standing your ground isn't just about silence. It's about knowing that you represent something larger than yourself. That's not an easy task, especially when faced with hostility." Derek swallowed, nodding as he absorbed his captain's words. Yet, a part of him still wrestled with the question of whether the silence he was trained to maintain was truly the right path. That slap had rattled something within him, something that felt too big to ignore. As he left the captain's office and walked across the palace grounds, Derek noticed Daniel standing alone by the gate. The boy seemed to be waiting for him, his small figure dwarfed by the imposing iron bars of the fence. "Sir," the boy stammered as Derek approached, his gaze fixed on the ground. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get you in trouble. My aunt, she said it was just for fun, but it didn't feel right." Derek knelt down to the boy's level, meeting his gaze. "It's okay, Daniel," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes people think things are just for fun, but they don't realize the harm they're doing. Remember this, it's always important to treat people with respect, no matter who they are or what they're doing." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with a newfound understanding. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, before turning and hurrying back to rejoin the crowd. Derek watched him go, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since the slap, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, his silent stance could make a difference. But as he turned back to his duties, he knew that this was only the beginning of a deeper internal struggle, one that would challenge his view of what it meant to truly serve with dignity and honor. The weight of silence. As the weeks passed, the slap and the unsettling encounter with Lucy continued to linger in Derek's mind, casting a shadow over his otherwise steady routines. In every silent moment on duty, he felt a gnawing restlessness, a tension simmering beneath his practiced composure. That single slap had unlocked something he couldn't shake, an unspoken question that seemed to haunt him. Was silence truly his strongest stance? It wasn't long before whispers began circulating among the other guards, stories and murmurs spreading of the incident at East Gate. While some viewed Derek's restraint as commendable, others hinted that he should have done more. A few guards expressed frustration at the rules they followed, feeling the pressure of a job that asked them to be a fixture, a symbol without a voice. Derek, once perfectly aligned with these values, found himself torn. One evening, as he prepared to leave the palace grounds after a long day, Derek was approached by Officer Edward Branson, a tall, broad-shouldered guard with nearly a decade of service behind him. Branson was known for his unwavering loyalty to tradition, but had earned a reputation as someone who didn't mince words. "Evans, Branson greeted, his voice a low rumble. Heard about what happened with that tourist. Word is she crossed a line, slapped you right across the face. Derek stiffened, though he knew the gossip was unavoidable. Yes, sir, he replied, his tone neutral. She did. I did my duty, sir, and followed protocol. Branson nodded, folding his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. I've seen my share of unruly tourists, Evans, but rarely one who thinks she can just walk up to us and take a swipe. Did you report it? Captain Harrison addressed it at the time, Derek said, holding Branson's gaze. He said she was removed from the premises. But you know how it is. She was just asked to leave, nothing more. Branson exhaled sharply. We're expected to stand like statues, he muttered, almost to himself. And sometimes, Evans, I wonder if that makes us nothing more than decoration. I respect the role, don't get me wrong, but there are times I wonder if we've been trained to swallow down too much. Derek was taken aback by Branson's candor. The older guard was typically the first to defend the honor of the post, yet here he was, hinting at a shared frustration. It was both a relief and a shock to hear Branson voice what Derek had been struggling with internally. For the first time, he felt he wasn't entirely alone in his doubts. The conversation stayed with Derek long after he left the palace grounds, filling his thoughts as he walked home through the busy London streets. The city had a rhythm that comforted him, a bustling anonymity that allowed him to feel invisible, blending into the ebb and flow of people and lights. But tonight, he felt exposed, his mind replaying the slap, Branson's words, and his own inability to reconcile his duty with his pride. That night, sleep eluded him, his mind restless as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The job, which had once been his source of pride, felt heavy, as if every inch of his uniform was a weight pressing down on him, constricting his breath. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to find clarity, but the questions only multiplied, each one circling back to a single truth. He was losing faith in the silence he had once considered his strength. The following morning, Derek awoke with a sense of resolve. He decided to visit his mentor, retired Lieutenant Colonel Harold Dawes, a man who had served over 40 years in the British Army before dedicating his later years to guiding younger soldiers. Dawes had been instrumental in Derek's journey to the Royal Guard, always offering advice laced with wisdom and empathy. If anyone could help him make sense of this internal struggle, it was the lieutenant colonel. Dawes lived in a modest cottage in a quiet part of the city, his home filled with memories of his service, the walls adorned with medals, photographs, and mementos from his years abroad. Derek felt a sense of peace whenever he entered the space, a reminder of the honor he had once aspired to, of the purpose he'd felt when he first put on the uniform. The retired officer greeted Derek with a firm handshake and a knowing look, as though he could sense the young man's unease. They settled into the small living room, the afternoon light casting warm shadows across the old leather chairs. Derek, Dawes began, leaning back with a calm that spoke of years of experience. Something tells me you didn't come here just to share a cup of tea. Derek chuckled, though his smile was tight. I need some guidance, sir, he admitted. I've been struggling with my role, with what happened recently at the palace. Dawes nodded, his eyes never leaving Derek's. I heard about the incident, son. A slap from a tourist. Racist, from what they say. Derek's gaze dropped to his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. Yes, sir. She slapped me. She taunted me, called me names. And I stood there, like I was supposed to. Like I'd been trained to. But since then, I haven't felt right about it. I've always been proud of my position. But now it feels like a burden. Dawes was silent for a moment, studying Derek with the same keen focus he had used on new recruits years ago. Derek, do you know why you're really struggling? Derek shook his head, feeling a lump form in his throat. No, sir. I thought it was just part of the job. I thought I was supposed to be able to handle it. Dawes leaned forward, his gaze intense. Son, you're struggling because you've been taught that silence is strength. But no one told you that silence can also be a shackle. You stood there because you were trained to, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt you. And that's what's weighing on you now. You're questioning if you can keep on standing silent when someone challenges who you are, not just as a guard, but as a man. The words hit Derek like a wave, unlocking a clarity he hadn't expected. He had been trying to suppress the pain, convinced that enduring it was part of his duty. But Dawes' words made him realize that his silence had cost him more than he'd understood. "Sir," he began, his voice hesitant, "does that mean I was wrong to stand there? Should I have done something?" Dawes smiled, a gentle yet firm expression. "Strength isn't about what you do in the moment, Derek. It's about what you stand for. Sometimes standing silent is the right path, but there are also times when silence becomes complicity. You have to decide which moments require strength in silence and which require strength in voice." The weight of Dawes' advice settled over Derek, a new perspective that both lifted and burdened him. He nodded slowly, his thoughts churning with a mixture of understanding and uncertainty. The next few days, Derek found himself reflecting on the lieutenant colonel's words. Each shift at Buckingham Palace, each hour of standing silently, now felt different, as though he were aware of the inner conflict with every passing second. He resumed his duties with a newfound resolve to not just uphold his role but to decide, moment by moment, how he would carry it. One late afternoon, as he neared the end of his shift, he noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the crowd. It was Daniel, Lucy's nephew, holding his toy guard figure, his small frame hunched as he nervously shifted from foot to foot. Derek's heart softened at the sight of the boy. He could sense the child's uncertainty, his need to say something but not knowing how to begin. Breaking protocol just slightly, Derek gave the boy a small nod, an unspoken permission to approach him. Daniel stepped forward hesitantly, glancing up with wide eyes. "Sir," he whispered, clutching his toy tightly, "I wanted to say sorry. For my aunt. She told me it was just a joke, but it didn't feel right. I didn't know what to say then. But I know it wasn't fair." Derek felt a pang of empathy as he looked down at the boy. "Thank you, Daniel," he said softly. "It's brave to speak up when something doesn't feel right. And sometimes that bravery can make all the difference." The boy nodded, his face reflecting a mixture of shame and relief. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to wear the uniform too." Derek swallowed, touched by the boy's words, yet knowing the weight that came with such a role. "Then remember, Daniel," he said gently, "being strong isn't just about what you wear. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's what makes you a real guard." The boy's eyes brightened, and he nodded with a newfound sense of pride. As he turned to rejoin his family, Derek felt a renewed purpose stir within him. He had made a choice that day, a decision not just to wear the uniform, but to carry its honor with a voice when necessary. As he resumed his stance, Derek knew he was no longer just a silent symbol. He had become something more, a man committed to both the tradition he upheld and the values he would choose to defend, not just for himself, but for those who looked up to him. Breaking the silence. In the days following his conversation with young Daniel and the advice from Lieutenant Colonel Dawes, Derek felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to terms with the idea that his duty wasn't solely to stand still and endure silently. Sometimes it demanded that he stand up in ways that transcended tradition. But what this meant in practice, he wasn't entirely sure, until the day Lucy returned. It was a cloudy afternoon, and a light drizzle had begun to fall as Derek took his place at the east gate. His mind was calm, his posture unwavering. He had settled into a rhythm again, each step and stance a part of his disciplined routine. But just as he began to think that he might finally move past the troubling incident, a commotion near the gate caught his attention. At first, Derek couldn't see the cause of the disturbance, but as the crowd parted, his heart sank. Lucy was back, this time without the young boy, but with a small group of other tourists who seemed all too eager to be a part of her performance. She was gesturing animatedly, her voice loud and brash, drawing the attention of passers-by, as if she were some twisted kind of tour guide. Derek felt the familiar tightening in his chest as he watched her approach, her face set in a determined expression that he recognized all too well. But this time, instead of staying silent and enduring her taunts, he felt a shift within himself, a calm yet unyielding resolve to take control of the situation. His encounter with Daniel had reminded him that his role could serve as an example, that his silence was not a shield but a choice. And today, he would choose differently. As Lucy drew closer, she made a grand, mocking gesture in Derek's direction. "Well, well, look who's back at his post. I see you've got your brave face on today," she sneered, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Do they teach you to stand there like a robot, or does that just come naturally?" Derek remained still, but this time he met her gaze, his eyes steady and clear. A few of the tourists around her exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with her tone but reluctant to confront her. Lucy seemed to thrive on the attention, her voice growing louder as she egged on her small audience. "Come on," she continued, turning to the others with a smirk. "Who here wants to see if we can get him to flinch? I bet he's not as tough as he looks." Derek felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his expression calm. He could sense the growing tension in the crowd, the whispers and exchanged glances as people realized that her behavior was crossing a line. And as he looked into the faces of the onlookers, he felt something within him shift, a conviction that standing silent was no longer enough. In a low, steady voice, Derek spoke, his words clear and calm, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Madam, this is a place of respect. If you have come here to provoke or ridicule, I suggest you take your behavior elsewhere." The crowd hushed immediately, a ripple of shock passing through those gathered. The guards rarely spoke, and even fewer would openly address a member of the public. Lucy's smirk faltered, her confidence momentarily shaken as she realized that Derek had broken his silence. "Oh, so you can speak," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "It's about time you stopped hiding behind that uniform and acted like a real person." Derek held her gaze, his expression firm. "This uniform represents centuries of honor and duty," he said, his voice unwavering. "But that doesn't give anyone the right to disrespect it, or those who wear it." Around them, people began murmuring in agreement, nodding and casting disapproving looks in Lucy's direction. For the first time, the crowd seemed to shift away from her, their expressions no longer amused but disdainful. Lucy's bravado wavered, and she glanced around, realizing that her audience was turning against her. "Honor and duty," she scoffed, attempting to regain her composure. "You're just standing there like a statue. How's that honoring anything?" Derek's voice remained steady, though there was a quiet intensity in his words. Duty is not always about action. Sometimes it's about standing firm, even when others would have you falter. But duty is also about defending what's right. And today, that means standing up against those who disrespect what this place stands for. A few people in the crowd began clapping, a slow, building applause that seemed to further unnerve Lucy. She cast a look of frustration around her, realizing that the crowd's support was slipping through her fingers. Her face flushed as she tried to maintain her composure, but the confidence she had arrived with was rapidly eroding. One of the tourists, a young woman with a camera around her neck, spoke up, her voice filled with quiet authority. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said to Lucy. "Why come here if you don't even respect the guards? Just leave him alone." Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, some murmuring their disapproval. Lucy's face twisted with anger, but she clearly understood that she was outnumbered. With a last huff, she turned on her heel, her pride wounded as she walked away, leaving a trail of disappointed murmurs behind her. As she departed, Derek felt a weight lift from his chest. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't let anger dictate his actions, but he had broken the silence in a way that honored his position and upheld the respect he had for his duty. He had defended the dignity of his role not by retaliating, but by calmly asserting what he stood for. After a moment, the crowd began to disperse, the mood lighter, many people nodding to him in respect as they passed. Derek felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, a reassurance that he had done the right thing. As the ceremony ended and the guards made their way back into the palace, Captain Harrison met Derek with a look that was both stern and approving. He gestured for Derek to follow him into a quiet corridor just inside the palace walls, away from prying eyes and ears. "Evans," the captain began, his voice calm but firm, "you know you took a risk today. Speaking out like that in front of the public, if it hadn't gone the way it did, there could have been consequences." Derek nodded, standing tall. "Yes, sir, I understand. But I felt it was necessary. She was crossing a line, not just with me but with what we represent. I wanted her to know that I'm here not just as a guard, but as a man who respects the duty I've sworn to uphold." Captain Harrison studied him for a moment, a hint of a smile softening his otherwise stern expression. "You handled yourself well, Sergeant. In fact, you did something few guards would have dared to do, and you did it with dignity." He paused, nodding thoughtfully. "There are times when standing silent is a sign of strength. But today, you showed that sometimes strength also means knowing when to speak." Derek felt a surge of pride, tempered by humility. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. "I've always believed that this uniform stands for something greater than any of us. But today, I realized it also stands for the people who wear it, for our voices and our dignity." Captain Harrison nodded approvingly. "Just remember, Evans, that every decision we make has consequences, but sometimes doing the right thing is worth the risk." He extended his hand, and Derek shook it firmly, a sense of mutual respect passing between them. As Derek left the captain's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had defended his duty not by raising his voice or stooping to the level of those who taunted him, but by standing up with conviction, showing that strength could take many forms. That evening, as he walked through the palace grounds, Derek was approached by a family of tourists, a mother, father, and their young daughter. The little girl looked up at him with wide eyes, her small hand clutching a miniature toy guard that looked strikingly like him. "Are you the guard who spoke up today?" the mother asked, her voice filled with admiration. "We heard about what happened. Thank you for standing up for yourself. I think it meant a lot to everyone who saw it." Derek smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thank you, Mom," he replied. "It was my honor." The little girl held up her toy soldier, her face glowing with pride. "I want to be like you someday," she said, her voice filled with youthful certainty. Derek knelt down, meeting her gaze with a gentle smile. "Then remember, being the guard isn't just about standing still. It's about standing strong for what you believe in. If you can do that, you'll be a great guard someday." The girl nodded solemnly, clutching her toy guard even tighter as her parents smiled down at her. As they walked away, Derek watched them go, feeling the significance of his actions settle deeply within him. He had broken the silence, yes, but he had done so with purpose, with a dignity that honored his role and the values he cherished. As the evening sky darkened over Buckingham Palace, Derek stood in the quiet solitude of his post, a renewed sense of peace washing over him. He had discovered that silence could be powerful, but so too could a voice that spoke with honor and integrity. And as he stood guard that night, he knew that he would carry both with him, a balance of strength and resolve that made him more than just a guard. It made him a man true to himself and to the duty he held dear. The ripple of resilience. The incident at Buckingham Palace had left its mark, spreading beyond the palace grounds and even beyond the local news. Tourists and residents alike shared their accounts of Derek's quiet stand, admiring the strength he'd shown that day. Over the next few days, Derek became something of a local hero, especially among the younger guards, who saw in him a model of dignity and resilience. It was a humbling experience, But it also came with a weight of responsibility he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as he was leaving the palace grounds, Derek was approached by a young man he recognized from his early training days. The young guard, Officer Liam Hughes, was fresh-faced and full of enthusiasm, but had struggled with his confidence during training. Derek had often taken Liam aside, giving him pointers and reassuring him that everyone found their footing in time. "Sergeant Evans," Liam called, jogging up to him with a look of admiration in his eyes. "I wanted to thank you for what you did the other day." "Well, it's just that it made a difference to see you stand up like that. Sometimes I feel like I'm just here, holding my breath, waiting for the shift to end. You made me realize it's about more than just standing still." Derek nodded, listening intently. "Thank you, Hughes. I'm glad it meant something to you. But remember, we don't just stand for ourselves. We stand for each other, and for everyone who believes in what this uniform represents. You're a part of that too." The young guard's face lit up with newfound resolve, and Derek felt a sense of pride as he watched him walk away, a little taller and a little more self-assured. It was a reminder that sometimes a single action could create ripples, inspiring others in ways he hadn't foreseen. As the days passed, Derek's actions continued to resonate, but they also caught the attention of his superiors. Captain Harrison had initially supported Derek's decision to speak out, but as the incident gained more attention, pressure from higher-ups began to complicate things. The traditionalists within the ranks argued that guards were to be seen and not heard, that Derek's actions, however dignified, had veered too close to breaking decorum. One afternoon, Derek was called into a meeting with Captain Harrison and a few other senior officers. The air in the room was tense, and Derek could tell from their expressions that this wasn't just a routine discussion. Captain Harrison greeted him with a nod, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Sergeant Evans," Captain Harrison began, his tone formal, "we've gathered to discuss the impact of the recent incident and your decision to address a member of the public while on duty. This isn't an inquiry, but it is a review." Derek met the captain's gaze, maintaining a calm, respectful demeanor. He knew this was coming. The Royal Guard, with its strict code of conduct and traditions, was built on unwavering formality. Speaking out as he had was seen as breaking protocol, a reminder to Derek that the institution often valued silence over any form of personal expression. One of the senior officers, Colonel Bradford, leaned forward, fixing Derek with a scrutinizing stare. "Sergeant Evans, the Royal Guard is a symbol of the Crown. For centuries, we have maintained this position without words, without acknowledgement of provocations or disrespect. By breaking that silence, you may have unintentionally set a precedent." Derek listened patiently, choosing his words carefully before responding. "With respect, Colonel, I believe that the role of the Guard is not diminished by standing up against direct disrespect. My silence that day would have given tacit approval to behavior that defies the very honor we uphold." The room fell silent, his words hanging in the air. Captain Harrison nodded slightly, a subtle encouragement that told Derek he wasn't entirely alone in his stance. But Colonel Bradford remained unconvinced. "The problem, Evans," Bradford said, his voice crisp and unyielding, "is that this isn't about one incident. The moment we break from tradition, we open the door for others to do the same, and soon we lose the very image we are sworn to protect." Derek's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Sir, I understand the importance of tradition, but I believe that respect isn't something we demand, it's something we earn. And sometimes, earning it means standing up when silence isn't enough." Another officer, Major Collins, spoke up, his tone less harsh. "Evans, no one is questioning your commitment or your integrity. In fact, many of us admire what you did. But there are consequences that come with public scrutiny. Some are questioning if you have taken the role too personally." Derek considered this, understanding the fine line he had walked. "If I may, sir, I believe the public has seen that the Guard is more than just a symbol. We are people, and if we show them that we stand for something real, something worth respecting. It only strengthens our role." Captain Harrison nodded again, visibly impressed by Derek's conviction. "Evans, you've presented your point well. We'll take this under advisement." The meeting ended with a mixed sense of resolution and uncertainty. Derek felt he had defended his actions with integrity, but he also understood that his decision had stirred the waters in a way that might have lasting consequences. As he left the room, Captain Harrison caught up with him, pulling him aside. "You did well, Derek," he said quietly, using Derek's first name in a rare show of camaraderie. "It's not easy to face down the weight of tradition, but sometimes it's necessary. Just know that I've got your back. But there will be eyes on you now. Stay vigilant." Derek nodded, appreciating the captain's support. "Thank you, sir. I understand." The following weeks were a strange mix of heightened scrutiny and quiet admiration. Derek could feel the watchful eyes of the senior officers, their evaluations woven into every shift, every gesture. But he also noticed a growing respect among his fellow guards, particularly among the younger recruits, who saw him as a figure of resilience and strength. It was a delicate balance, and Derek knew he would need to tread carefully. One rainy afternoon, as Derek was preparing to begin his shift, he spotted a familiar face waiting just outside the palace gate. Young Daniel, clutching an envelope in his small hands, his eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Derek walked over, his expression softening as he greeted the boy. "Daniel, good to see you. What brings you here?" Daniel held up the envelope, looking a bit shy. I wrote you a letter. I thought maybe you'd like it. My mom helped me with it." Touched, Derek took the envelope and carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was uneven, the words carefully chosen, and each line reflected a heartfelt sincerity that warmed him to his core. "Dear Sergeant Evans, I wanted to say thank you for being brave. My mom told me that being strong isn't always about fighting. She said sometimes it's about speaking up, even if it's scary. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Thank you for showing me what it means to be a real guard. Yours, Daniel." Derek felt a lump in his throat as he read the words, each sentence resonating deeply. He knelt down to Daniel's level, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel. This means a lot to me. And remember, being brave is about doing what's right, even if no one else understands it." The boy nodded, a serious expression on his face. "I will, sir. And maybe one day, I'll wear the uniform, too." Derek placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I have no doubt you will. And when you do, you'll carry that bravery with you." As Daniel walked away, Derek felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. He realized that his decision to speak up hadn't just been about one incident. It had been about setting an example, about showing others that duty was not a silent, passive act. It was a choice, one that required both strength and conviction. In the days that followed, Derek continued to perform his duties with a heightened awareness of his role. He understood that tradition was important, but so was the humanity that lay behind it. He felt the gaze of the public upon him, the whispers of admiration, the respectful nods from tourists and colleagues alike. He had become a silent figure of resilience, a symbol not only of duty but of the courage to stand for one's beliefs. One afternoon, during a break, Captain Harrison approached him with an unexpected offer. "Evans," the captain began, his tone formal but warm, "the officers and I have discussed your situation, and we've decided that a man like you deserves an opportunity to lead. We're offering you a position as training sergeant for the new recruits. You'd be able to instill in them the values you hold dear, the ones you've shown us firsthand." Derek felt a surge of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I would be honored." The captain nodded, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've shown us that strength isn't just about standing still. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stand up. That's a lesson worth passing on." And so, Derek transitioned into his new role, guiding the next generation of Royal Guards, instilling in them not only the discipline of silence, but also the wisdom of knowing when to speak. He taught them to stand tall, not just as symbols, but as men and women of integrity, of courage. In time, his legacy grew, touching the lives of countless recruits who would go on to stand guard at Buckingham Palace. And though Derek Evans became known as a man who broke silence, he would forever be remembered as a man who upheld tradition with both dignity and strength, a legacy that went beyond any one incident, woven into the fabric of the institution he had devoted his life to. A legacy of strength. Months had passed since Derek Evans became a training sergeant for the Royal Guard, yet the ripple effects of his moment at Buckingham Palace continued to influence not only his life, but the very spirit of the Guard itself. Under his guidance, new recruits approached their duties with a sense of purpose that went beyond the silent traditions. They learned that wearing the uniform wasn't just about standing still, it was about standing firm in their values and knowing, as Derek had shown, that sometimes duty required more than silence. Derek's new role had its challenges. He was no longer just an observer, silently enduring the taunts and provocations of the crowd. Now he bore the responsibility of shaping the character of those who would one day take his place. Every day, he stood in front of eager, fresh-faced recruits who looked to him with respect and curiosity, eager to learn the art of standing with dignity. But he knew that he had to impart more than mere posture and discipline. He had to teach them the value of resilience, the strength to stand up for themselves while honoring the traditions they represented. One afternoon, as Derek finished a session on ceremonial protocol with his recruits, he noticed a quiet young man lingering at the edge of the training ground. The boy looked out of place, wearing civilian clothes, his gaze fixed on the line of recruits practicing their drills. Derek recognized him instantly. Daniel, the boy whose heartfelt letter had set him on this path of reflection and change. Derek approached him with a smile. "Daniel, what brings you here?" The boy looked up, clutching his toy soldier, now slightly worn from use, but still bearing the proud red uniform. "I wanted to see you train, Sergeant Evans. I wanted to see how the new guards learn to be like you." Derek knelt down to his level, a warm pride filling his chest. "Well, I'm glad you came, Daniel. Being a guard isn't just about the training, though. It's about what's inside, too. You don't have to wear a uniform to stand up for what's right." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, his eyes wide with understanding. "But I want to be brave like you. I want to help people, to show them respect." Derek felt a lump in his throat. "You're already brave, Daniel. You've shown that you understand respect. And one day, whether you wear a uniform or not, I know you'll stand for what's right." They shared a quiet moment, and then Derek noticed someone standing nearby, watching them with a soft expression, a woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile that reminded him of kindness personified. She approached, offering Derek her hand. "Hello, Sergeant Evans," she said warmly. "I'm Daniel's mother, Claire. He's been talking about you for months, and I wanted to thank you. You've made a difference in his life." Derek smiled, humbled. "Thank you, ma'am. Daniel's a fine young man. He's the kind of person who reminds me why we wear the uniform, why we serve." Claire looked at her son with pride, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "He's been carrying that little soldier everywhere, even to bed. I think you've inspired him in ways words can't express." As they spoke, a few of Derek's recruits observed the exchange, their eyes alight with newfound admiration for their sergeant. Derek realized that his legacy was taking shape not only in his actions, but in the lives he touched, the people he inspired, and the lessons he instilled. Over the following months, Derek's approach to training began to influence the very culture of the Guard. He taught his recruits the importance of honoring tradition, but also the value of integrity, of knowing when silence was strength, and when silence was a surrender of dignity. He held seminars on resilience and respect, where guards could discuss the challenges they faced in silence and the struggles they endured. It was unorthodox, and it didn't sit well with every officer, but Captain Harrison supported him, recognizing that Derek's approach was revitalizing the Guard, infusing it with a sense of purpose that resonated with the changing times. One day, Derek was surprised to receive an invitation to Buckingham Palace itself, not as a guard, but as a guest. He was to attend a private ceremony in the East Wing, honoring members of the Guard who had shown exceptional dedication to their roles. As he dressed in his formal attire, he felt a mix of pride and humility, wondering what this honor would mean for his journey. As he entered the Grand Hall, Derek was greeted by familiar faces, fellow guards, senior officers, and even some high-ranking officials he rarely saw outside of ceremonial events. Standing at the far end of the hall was Captain Harrison, who nodded in acknowledgement, a gleam of pride in his eyes. The ceremony began with a few formal speeches on the importance of the Guard, its history, and its future. Then, to Derek's surprise, Captain Harrison stepped forward and began to speak, his voice steady and resonant. Today, we recognize Sergeant Derek Evans, a man who has shown us that strength is not merely in standing still, but in standing up. He reminded us all that to wear this uniform is to uphold more than tradition. It is to carry a responsibility to our community and to our own dignity. Derek felt his heart swell as Captain Harrison continued, his words laced with respect and admiration. Sergeant Evans faced a challenge that tested his commitment to our principles, and in that moment, he chose to uphold not just his role, but the values that define it. He showed us all that silence can be powerful, but so can a voice that speaks with integrity. Captain Harrison extended a medal to Derek, the insignia of honor and dignity, an award rarely given, reserved for those who demonstrated exceptional courage and moral fortitude. Derek accepted it with gratitude, his chest tight with emotion. The crowd applauded, a powerful and heartfelt acknowledgement that resonated through the Grand Hall, and Derek felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his journey had led him to this moment. After the ceremony, as the hall began to empty, Captain Harrison approached Derek with a quiet smile. "You've changed things, Derek," he said, his voice warm with pride. "Not just for yourself, but for all of us. I don't think we'll ever look at our role the same way again." Derek nodded, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Thank you, sir. I never wanted to change tradition, only to honor it in a way that felt true." Captain Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "And that you have. Tradition is strongest when it evolves with purpose, not when it remains rigid. You've reminded us all of that." In the days that followed, Derek returned to his role as training sergeant, his heart light with a sense of accomplishment. He knew that the honor he had received wasn't just for him. It was for every guard who had faced the same silent struggles and endured with dignity. He continued to teach his recruits not only the discipline of silence, but the strength of self-respect, showing them that to be a guard was to be a person of conviction, willing to stand firm when the moment called for it. One evening, as he was leaving the training grounds, he was approached by a young recruit who had been one of his most diligent students. The recruit, visibly nervous, held out a letter. "Sergeant Evans," he began, his voice faltering slightly. "I wanted to thank you. You've shown me what it means to wear this uniform with pride, but also with purpose. This letter, it's from my father. He was in the Guard before me, and he's proud of what you've taught us." Derek accepted the letter, touched by the recruit's sincerity. He opened it, reading the heartfelt words of a man who had once stood in his shoes, who understood the weight of silence and the power of strength. The words resonated deeply, a reminder that his journey had connected him to a legacy that stretched far beyond his own experience. As Derek read, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet understanding that his actions would echo through the years, inspiring future generations of guards to stand not only as symbols, but as individuals of honor and courage. In the years that followed, Derek Evans became a figure of inspiration, his legacy woven into the very fabric of the Royal Guard. His name was spoken with respect, his teachings passed down as part of the training that shaped each new recruit. He continued to serve with humility and pride, knowing that he had not only upheld tradition, but had transformed it in a way that honored the dignity of those who wore the uniform. And in time, Buckingham Palace became not just a place of silent strength, but a place where the guards were seen as symbols of both resilience and humanity. Derek's legacy endured, a reminder that to stand with dignity was to stand with purpose, and that true strength was found not only in silence but in the courage to speak when it mattered most. As the years went on, Derek looked back on his journey with a sense of peace, knowing that he had lived true to his values. He had carved a path that honored both tradition and transformation, and as he watched the new generation of guards take their place, he felt a quiet pride, knowing that his voice had become a part of the story he had once stood in silence to protect. In the end, Derek Evans' legacy was not just a mark on the history of the Royal Guard. It was a legacy of strength, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what was right, a legacy that would inspire generations to come.